Part 115. The Treaty. The rumors regarding Uthman inadvertently accelerated the negotiation process, as the Quraysh became acutely aware of what the Muslims, fueled by Iman, were willing to do. They first sent Mikraz ibn Hafs to no avail, but then finally sent a senior delegate. Suhail ibn Amr. Suhail would later accept Islam and cement himself as a man of piety and honor, but at this moment in time was still against Islam. The Quraysh instructed Suhail that he may compromise on any clause except that the Muslims were not to perform Umrah this year, as it would seem like a defeat for the Quraysh in the eyes of the neighboring Arabs. Suhail sat with the Prophet to draw up a treaty, and the Prophet chose Ali as his scribe. The Prophet dictated, "In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, most merciful." Suhail interrupted the Prophet and said,
"As for this phrase, I have never heard it, and I do not know this most compassionate, Al-Rahman. Instead write, 'In the name of Allah,' as we are accustomed."
The Prophet agreed, then dictated, "This is an agreement between Muhammad, the Messenger of Allah, and Suhail ibn Amr." As Ali wrote, "Messenger of Allah," Suhail interrupted again.
"As for you being the Messenger of Allah, had we believed this to be true, we would not prevent you from the Kaaba, nor would we have fought you. Instead, write, Muhammad ibn Abdullah."
The Prophet said, "By Allah, I am the Messenger of Allah, even if you deny it." He then instructed Ali to write Muhammad ibn Abdullah. Angered and defiant, Ali refused to erase Messenger of Allah, so the Prophet scratched it out with his own blessed hand. The Prophet then stipulated that the Quraysh must allow the Muslims to perform Umrah. Suhail said,
"As for this year, then no. Rather that will be next year."
Suhail then added extra conditions.
"Any man that renegades from the Quraysh must be handed back to Mecca."
Suhail's own children were locked up in Mecca for attempting to leave and join the Prophet, so Suhail personally benefited from this stipulation. The Muslims were outraged at such a suggestion, as most Muslims were emigrants. They remarked,
"How can we return a Muslim to the polytheists after they come to us as a Muslim?"
Ali also argued against this stipulation, refusing to write it down. Suddenly, in an extraordinary turn of events, the clanging of chains was heard from afar, and it was none other than Abu Jandal, the son of Suhail ibn Amr. He had escaped from his dungeon after years of imprisonment. Previously, escape was futile, as there was no way to travel to Medina, but he must have heard of the Muslims' presence and seized the opportunity to escape. Not realizing his father was present, he began screaming,
"Help, O Muslims!"
Unbeknownst to Abu Jandal, he was a live embodiment of the very stipulation being debated. Suhail pointed to his son and said,
"O Muhammad, this is the first person upon whom the stipulation will be applied."
The Prophet remarked that the stipulation had not even been written yet, but Suhail was so emotionally invested that he threatened to abandon the entire treaty if the condition was not accepted. The Prophet then negotiated, "Gift him to me." In other words, let Abu Jandal stay, and the stipulation will be enforced thereafter. Suhail refused, and the Prophet continued to request, "Just do it." It is the only time in the entire Seerah where the Prophet insisted on a matter to such an extent, but Suhail would not acquiesce. Eventually, Mikraz suggested that Abu Jandal remain, but that his safety and good treatment would be guaranteed, and the Prophet reluctantly accepted. Abu Jandal cried in despair,
"O Muslims, will you return me to the pagans after I have come to you as a Muslim? Don't you see what they have done to me?"
For years, Abu Jandal was counting the days until he joined the Muslims, and when his moment finally came, he was being turned back at the final moment. The marks of torture were visible on his body from years of brutal treatment. The Prophet turned and addressed him directly. "Be patient and await the rewards of the hereafter, O Abu Jandal, for Allah will make a way out for you all." Truly enraged, Umar stood up and approached Abu Jandal.
"Be patient, O Abu Jandal.
He then gestured to his sword with his eyes and said,
Their blood is not worth anything."
The implication was clear, but Abu Jandal did not act on Umar's suggestion. The condition of returning renegades only applied to the Muslims. Conversely, it was demanded that any Muslim who apostates and flees to Mecca is not to be sent back to Medina. The treaty also stipulated that there would be no fighting between the two sides for 10 years. Moreover, both groups may engage in treaties with any tribe, and the same conditions must apply to said tribe. It was finally decided that the Muslims may perform Umrah next year, and the Quraysh would vacate the city for 3 days, while the Muslims completed their pilgrimage. Umar could not contain himself, asking the Prophet rhetorically,
Are you not the messenger of Allah?
The Prophet said, Yes. Umar asked,
Are we not upon the truth and our enemies upon misguidance?
The Prophet said, Yes. Umar then asked,
Then how can we accept the lower hand of humiliation and be disgraced in our religion?
The Prophet replied resolvedly, I am the messenger of Allah, and I will not disobey Allah. He will help me. Umar then attempted a new line of reasoning, asking,
O messenger of Allah, didn't you tell me that we would be performing tawaf around the house of Allah?
The Prophet replied, Indeed I did. But did I tell you it was this year? Umar replied,
No.
The Prophet thus said, Then you will indeed come and perform tawaf around it. Umar was angered for the sake of Allah, not himself, as he could not bear the religion of Islam being harmed. Nevertheless, the Prophet was more aligned with Allah's commands than Umar, and the Prophet insisted on peace, relying on the help of Allah. Umar could not quell his frustration. He approached Abu Bakr, undoubtedly the Prophet's second-in-command, and asked the same rhetorical questions. However, Abu Bakr replied angrily,
O man, he is the messenger of Allah and he will not disobey his Lord. So hang on to the stirrup of his saddle, otherwise there will be no hope for you.
Abu Bakr sternly warned Umar to know his place and stand firm alongside Allah's messenger, lest he be led astray. Umar later remarked,
After this, I continued to perform good deeds in the hope that Allah would forgive me for what I had done.
Umar was reported to have freed many slaves, prayed through many nights, and fasted many days to atone for his remarks. Although this emotional outburst was for the sake of Allah and His religion, it was not befitting to address the Prophet in that manner. The Muslims were forced to humble themselves to an extent they would not have tolerated had it been commanded by anyone other than Allah's messenger. However, even the Prophet's commands that day required the strongest of Iman to implement. After the representatives from the Quraysh left, the Prophet ordered the Muslims to shave their heads, slaughter their animals, and take off their ihram, despite not performing their intended Umrah. The Muslims were extremely demoralized after such an anticlimactic conclusion, and no one moved. The Prophet repeated his command again, and in an unprecedented moment in the Seerah, the companions did not immediately adhere to the Prophet's command. He repeated his command a third time, and perhaps due to the diffusion of responsibility phenomenon, whereby a person is less likely to take responsibility when addressed in a group, once again no one stood up. The Prophet retreated to his tent, and mother of the believers Salama noticed his visible agitation. She asked,
Do you wish that they follow you, O Messenger of Allah?
The Prophet replied in the affirmative, so she suggested,
Why don't you do it first? When they see you do it, they will follow suit.
The Prophet then began shaving his hair in public, and the companions rushed to follow suit. Despite their low morale, their hearts were always with the Messenger of Allah. The Muslims sent their sacrificed meat to the poor of Mecca, despite not being allowed in, and they left for Medina.